All right, last week we started talking about point number 6 on page 3 of your outline, creation versus evolution. And the controversy is important. I mean, it's a different worldview, if you will. And there's really no, and we'll talk about this in our next section, theistic evolution, but there's really no combining the two. I mean, the evolutionist, the atheist believes that, as Carl Sagan used to say on his TV program, the cosmos is all there is, the cosmos. Everything is physical, it's natural, it's material. There's nothing beyond this world. Everything's come about through naturalistic processes, which of course is impossible. Everything came from nothing. Life came from non-life. That's the general evolutionary atheistic view, while creationism, of course, affirms the fact that there is a spiritual world beyond this one, and that there is a God who created these things, and it is to Him we must answer one day, and it's before Him that we live our lives. And so just two different, diametrically opposed views of life and death and existence. And so and how you view, which side you take will result, frankly, in how you live, and certainly will determine how you die and where you spend eternity. And so you look at both of these, creationism versus evolution, they're really both models of our created order. And so you looked at the evidence to see which one is more consistent with the things that we know, the laws of nature and so forth. And so that's kind of what we've been looking at. And frankly, you know, even though you never get both sides, I mean, you know, they've taken over the schools, the colleges, the public school system. The media only tells one side, even though it's the wrong side. You don't get a fair shake. And that's the way it is when... But that's the way it is when truth is not on your side. You have to control and dominate the information system. And when you can't answer sound arguments, of course, what you do rather than argue the case is that you attack the other side personally. We see that in politics. It's much easier, rather than to argue or debate the merits of a position, to just tear down your foe, personally attack him. And so forth, try to discredit him some other way. And so we see that in this thing as well, this controversy. But we notice the creation model is the best predictor. For instance, and we noticed last week the law of biogenesis. Well, a scientific law, there's no known exception. Well, which model comports with the law of biogenesis? Which is consistent with the law of biogenesis? Is it evolution or creationism? Well, obviously it's creationism, because you can't get nothing from nothing. And life comes only from life. That's what Genesis 1 teaches, and that's what we've always found in the laboratory. And of course, to the evolutionist, time is the hero of the plot, as they like to say. If you have enough time, well, then anything can happen. Well, no, not anything can happen. Time is just time. It's not a creative force. It's not a power. It's just time. But uniformitarianism says, well, the present's the key to the past. Whatever's going on today has always been going on. Well, if that's true, their theory is still false. But if you go into 2 Peter 3, the same kind of people were alive and well 2,000 years ago. They say, hey, things go on as they've always gone on before. And the writer, the Holy Spirit, through Peter says, this they are willfully ignorant of. Reminds you of these people today, willfully ignorant of the fact that there was a flood that came and took everything away, took everyone away. And so uniformitarianism. And then we talked about, if there's going to be evolution, there has to be some mechanism. And supposedly according to Darwin, that mechanism was going to be natural selection, survival of the fittest. Of course, the problem with that is all that says is, hey, if you don't adapt, those that aren't well equipped or adapted, they go by the wayside. Well, that doesn't tell us how the others adapted. or how they got better. I mean, that's not a mechanism. That just kind of is an observation, really. And then they came along with the idea, well, it must be mutations then. The problem with that, of course, is that mutations are rare, and then 99% of them are harmful. I mean, that's, think about all the movies you go see. You ever gone to see a horror movie where the mutation was good? Well, I guess the X-Men, supposedly, those are good mutations. I've never seen an X-Man, personally, in my life. But they're bad. And so that's really not a mechanism that works. So here's the thing. If you were going to, if there was ever going to be evidence for evolution, I'm talking about hard physical evidence, where was that evidence going to have to come from? I'm talking about physical evidence. We started this last week. Where would it have to come from? Yeah, the fossil record. And Darwin said as much in his book. He said, well, I would expect that if my theory is true, that there would be all kinds of transitional forms in the fossil record. And that's where the evidence would be. And we noticed last week that if the evolutionary model is true, then you would, in the oldest rocks, you should find the most primitive forms of life, right? And then as you got to younger rocks, supposedly, you would find more complex forms of life, and there would be this, and then you would find these transitional forms, these things that are changing from one thing to another. On the other hand, if the creation model is true, it wouldn't matter how old or how young the rocks are, you would see all kinds of life forms, both simple and complex, mixed together, and you wouldn't find any transitional forms. And so that's what we were looking at last week. What does the fossil record support? And so there were these are three ideas that we were looking at. And number one, we were looking at abrupt appearance. Well, what do we find in the fossil record? Do we find, simple to complex or not? Well, no. We found an explosion of life. They call it the Cambrian explosion. Well, it all just came about at one time. Okay, well that supports not their theory. And then we were looking at stasis. Number 2 in your outline there refers to the fact that once you find these fossils in the rocks, that they remain the same. There's not any change over millions of years. There's not any transitional fossils. And in fact, I quoted from several evolutionists that basically said what? There's not any. And we don't use the fossil record to support our theory. Well, what do you use then? If there's no physical evidence for it. And why do you believe it? And I think we left off with this discussion, and really I just wanted to mention it more than anything, was the idea of living fossils. And we see this come along in the news every so often. They'll find some kind of creature, deep in the ocean or somewhere. They'll come across something and they'll say, oh, we thought this thing was extinct 500 million years ago. Well, the problem is the Earth's not been here that long. And so, yes, some of those things are hanging around. So number 3, that gets us down to number 3. That's where we want to kind of pick up today under the fossil record. Extinction. This is kind of interesting. According to the evolutionary paradigm, there's been 5 mass extinction events to occur in history. And I don't know how to pronounce these, but the Ordovician extinction 445 million years ago, 60 to 70% of the Earth species went extinct. The Devonian extinction, 360 to 375 million years ago, 75% disappeared of the Earth species. The Permian extinction, 252 million years ago, 95% The Triassic extinction, 200 million years ago, 70 to 80% disappeared. And the Cretaceous extinction, 65 to 66 million years ago, 75% of the Earth species went extinct. Well, that's what we're studying. That's the conclusion. So, of course, most of this is based upon, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, most of this is based upon radiometric dating, which, what does that mean? Yeah, they look at the decay rates, nuclear decay rates in various elements. And we'll talk about the flood a little bit, but most creationists believe that the conditions of the flood greatly accelerated the nuclear decay rates. And therefore you can't use those and say, well, the Earth's a gazillion million years old, because they weren't always the same. See, again, remember, evolution's based on uniformitarianism. Everything has to be going on just like it was before. There's no room for catastrophism. And when you have catastrophic events, that changes everything. And so, to them, so really, the creationist doesn't deny the fact that we have these extinction events. But of course, to the creationist, all of these 5 extinction events correlate to what one event? Yeah, the flood, which occurred for a year or more over a few thousand years ago. And basically what the geologic column and the fossil record is showing is an account of the flood's progression. And you could take each of these 5 major extinction events and say, hey, this is the destruction of just another major habitat or ecosystem as what happened? As the water rose. See, as the water rose. Another system was destroyed and buried. And, but here's the point. Regardless of whether you take the evolutionist position on this or the creationist position on this, everybody agrees that the fossil record is simply a record of what? I mentioned this last week. It's simply a record of what? Mass death, mass extinction. It's not a record of transitional forms. It's not a record of millions of years of evolutionary change. None of that's there. It's just a record of mass death. And that mass death, well, you wouldn't know that because their fossils wouldn't be in the record. Yeah. Seashells. Yeah. Well, how'd they get here? Or how did they get that far inland is, of course, the question. And that kind of stuff is found all the time. But the bottom line is that all the fossils we have, again, are found in sedimentary rock, which is laid down by water. So the fossil record is a compilation of creatures that appear abruptly. They're fully formed. There's no evolutionary history in the rocks where they're found. They remain the same throughout the record. And then sometimes, whole species, they just disappear. Well, yeah, they do disappear. Things happen, they don't adapt, and they're gone. And that fits, of course, the creation account, the flood account specifically as well, not the evolutionary account. The last point under that, I wanted to mention, I find it kind of interesting, is the case from homology, comparative arguments. Evolutionists like to provide evidence from what they call the comparative sciences, comparative anatomy, comparative physiology, cytology, biochemistry. When you're talking about homologous structures, you're talking about structures that are very similar in appearance. Not similar in function, that's analogous structures, but similar in appearance. Darwin thought that homology was one of the single greatest proofs of evolution. You say, well, what are you talking about? Well, if they can find creatures, if creatures across a broad spectrum have very similar structures, then to them that's a sign of what? Right. Common ancestry. If you look at a brother and sister, I would expect them normally to look more alike to each other than they would, say, their cousins, distant cousins. Why? Why? Well, they came from the same parents, right? Common ancestry. So if creatures on this earth all have these similar structures, then the evolutionist sees that as common ancestry. The creationist, of course, sees that as what? Common what? Not common ancestry, but common what? Yeah, somebody said common creator, common design. And the fact of the matter is, that would make sense because we all live in the same environment, right? You know, if you watch sci-fi movies, for instance, and you grew up, you Trekkies in here that like the old TV show Star Trek. You know, Spock, he used to like to talk about carbon-based species of creatures. What he meant by that is creatures from Earth, see? So you might go to another planet, and their planet, their creatures might be some other life form based on some other element. Because, see, they're in a different environment. Now, I don't believe there are any other creatures in outer space. I don't think there are any other life-making environments, personally. But the point is that we all live in the same environment, so it would make sense. I mean, we breathe the same air, same temperatures, same weather. Have to eat the same food. So it would make sense that there's going to be some similarities. Same gravitational pull. So we see it as common design. So, but at first glance you think, well, common ancestry, that seems like a pretty logical argument. And so here's what the evolutionist will say. He'll say things like, well, the wing of the bat, the forefoot of the turtle, the forefoot of the frog, and the arm of the man all have the same general structure. Or the forefoot of the dog, the flipper of the whale, the hand of a man all have the same, essentially the same bones and muscles. They all evolve from the same ancestor. That doesn't work out so well because what they do is, like they do in a lot of cases, they pick and choose things that are alike. Because after all, similarity proves common ancestry. So what do they generally ignore? Yeah, differences, right. You ignore the dissimilarities. And so after a while, when you throw in all of them, then the argument doesn't sound so good anymore. And so, so what they do is they, well, for instance, let me give you some examples. One scientist, veterinarian R.L. Weissong, provided an extensive list of some examples. He says the octopus eye, the pig heart, the Pekingese dog's face, milk of the donkey, and the pronator quadratus muscle of the Japanese salamander all are very similar to analogous human structures. Now, do you think they all have an evolutionary relation? Believe in an evolutionist statement. The weight of the brain in proportion to body weight is greater in the dwarf monkey of South America than it is in man, the Mormon said. Well, does that mean he's more evolved? I like this one. The root nodules of certain leguminous plants and the crustacean Daphnia contain hemoglobin, a blood pigment found in men. Do you think you're akin to certain leguminous plants? Believe in an evolution, say no. So that becomes a problem. So what they do is they move it to biomolecular studies and genetics. And so they look at things like blood groups, cytochrome C, enzymes, cellular DNA, other molecular units, and they'll come out and say something like this. Well, you know, chimpanzees and humans have DNA that's similar 99%. Boy, that sounds close, doesn't it? Well, that sounds good. But that has problems too, and this is the list I really enjoy reading. Because they really haven't gained much traction with that, because you go back to your 8th grade chemistry class or 9th grade biology class. And we all know that in living in cells there are chromosomes that carry your genes that are responsible for your genetic makeup. Everybody knows about chromosomes. So, if evolution is supposed to go from simple to complex, what would you expect when you're analyzing the chromosomes of any particular creature? Remember, we're supposed to go from simple to complex. So what should we find? As I go from simple to complex, and I'm looking at these creatures' chromosomes, what would I expect?
More than an X and a Y. More than X and Y.
No, but I would expect I would expect an increase in the number and the quality of the chromosomes, wouldn't I? If I'm going from simple to more complex. Well, let's look at that. This is a fun list. Let me give you a list of simple to complex, just some examples. We'll start on the bottom with a crayfish, then a fern. We're going up now. Reptiles, a herring gull, a bat, a dog, and a man. And that's from simple to complex in the evolutionary scheme. So, what would I expect to find chromosome count-wise, or I should find? I should find more in man at the top and the fewest in the crayfish, right?
Well, can I ask a question?
I don't know.
I'm not looking what mine I got, but you're wrong in saying we teach children that you will not evolve, but you just try to create a man and woman and then gain all.
That's true.
That's right.
Well, that's a little more complicated study than we're going to get into here, but if you want to read about that, Becky, I could recommend a book in Apologetics Press that talks about all of that, genetics, exactly how many exactly what the first man and woman would have had to have to create all the different colors and eye colors and all that kind of thing. Yeah, you can study that if you want. There's information out there. What do you think? All right, here's the order, reverse order from simple to complex. On the bottom is the bat. 32 chromosomes. Who do you think's next? Now, y'all ought to know how many chromosomes men we have, because that's something we study in school. Remember, your egg has a certain number and the sperm has a certain number, and they come together and then they have a total of what? 46. People have 46 chromosomes in each cell in the nucleus, and so man is second from the bottom. Bat has 32. We have 46. Reptiles have 48, so they're a little bit ahead of us. A herring gull has 68 chromosomes. A dog has 78. I think you were lower than a dog. A crayfish has 200 chromosomes. And number one at the top of the evolutionary chain is a fern. Treat your ferns well. 512 chromosomes in a fern. So, every time they think they find something, it just doesn't work out the way they thought it would or should. And we'll talk some more about this as we get a little further along some of these other areas. And I could have stuck this next topic, I guess, maybe a little bit later. Start talking about the age of the earth and the flood, but I didn't really know where to stick it. So we're going to move to Roman numeral 7, the bottom of page 3 of your outline, theistic evolution. And the reason I put it here is because, we've already mentioned that it's very unpopular, especially in the scientific world, but really anywhere in the media, anywhere else, to suggest that obviously the universe was created by God. It's even more unpopular to state that you believe it was created a few thousand years ago in 6 million days. That's ludicrous to most people. And you've got all this high-pressure scientific intimidation. And so you've got people who want to believe in God, want to believe in the Bible, who then somehow think that what they'll do is they will what? Yeah, we will somehow merge the two. You know, even though and this is the crazy thing about it, the evolutionists and the atheists don't care whether you merge the two. Because why? What is the very foundation of their belief? There is no God. There's nothing besides the material. So merging the two, just so you sound smarter, doesn't really help you in the atheistic community. And so the idea is, well, and I've heard people say this, well, I believe that God, you know, He created the universe billions of years ago, you know, the raw material, and then, you know, He used evolution, you know, for everything to come about. Well, the atheist doesn't care about that because he doesn't believe in God anymore. So why are you giving in to that when it's not going to really help you? They want to have their cake and eat it too. So, and we're going to talk about this in Roman numeral. Well, the next section is on Genesis 1 through 11. Is it historical or literal? But you basically have to toss Genesis 1 through 11 out the window and say, well, that's all just poetry. It's Hebrew poetry. It's not literal. It's figurative. Well, what's the problem with that? Let's throw Genesis 1 through 11 out. And we'll talk about this some more in more detail. But that doesn't get me around Exodus chapter 20, does it? I can throw Genesis 1 through 11 out, and then I go over to Exodus chapter 20, and I read verse 11. And what does he say? What does Moses say? And for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So I can jump, and we're going to look at some other verses too, even from the New Testament. But I can jump Genesis 1 through 11 out the window, and I've still got other problems in the biblical text. So at some point I have to decide, what do I believe and who do I believe? This verse says it only took 6 days. So, if I'm going to try to mold or meld these two ideas together, I've only got 3 options, right? What are my 3 options? Well, they're up on the screen.
Before creation.
Yeah, I've got to put in a bunch of time if I'm going to have an old earth. And if I'm going to merge it with the biblical record, I've got to look in the biblical record and decide, well, where am I going to insert this time? Where am I going to insert these billions of years? Well, I've only got 3 options, right? Either I've got to do it before the creation week. That's the gap theory. I can do it during the creation week, which is the day-age theory, which is much more popular. Or I can do it after the creation week. So those are the 3 that we want to talk about. So let's start with the gap theory. That suggests that there's a huge gap of time where? Where in the biblical text is this huge gap of time? Where does it have to be? You know, that's a lot to get in that little space, isn't it? Let's read that. In the beginning, Genesis 1:1 says, God created the heavens and the earth. Gap. Big billions of years.
Before that happened.
No. Right there, at that period.
Oh, okay.
Then verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. Now, that's a lot I got to get in after that period, before that next word. So what happened? What happened during that big gap of time, billions of years? Supposedly, what are we told? No, a lot happened. A lot happened. Supposedly, according to the gap theorists, God created an earth fully functional with animals, plants, and even pre-Adamic humans. And what happened, supposedly? They were destroyed. There was this big rebellion by Satan on earth. And God destroyed it all. Hence, verse 2, the earth was without form and void because God had destroyed it. And so what you have is a creation in verse 1, and then you have a restoration. Now, that's reading a lot into that. And so, but the problem, of course, is, well, let me give you some. There's several problems with it. One of the problems we just read, Exodus 20, verse 11. You still haven't gotten around that. Whenever you hear about some fanciful theory like that, it's kind of like, it's kind of like, 80, 70 people. What do they have to do to promote their theories? Yeah, you have to redefine terms, biblical terms, and you have to violate a lot of rules of grammar, both in Hebrew and Greek. And that's essentially what happens with any false theory. But here's what the gap theorist says. They say there's a distinction between two Hebrew words. B-A-R-A. I'm going to call that one. Does anybody know how to pronounce Hebrew in here? Which means to create. And A-S-A-H, I'm going to call that a sa, which means to make or fashion. So I've got a Hebrew word which means to create. I've got a Hebrew word which means to make, and they claim that when it comes to God's creative acts, these two words mean two different things, supposedly. So, He created it, then He fashioned it, recreated it, made it. It's two different events. Well, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, and I doubt there's too many here. But there are Hebrew scholars out there that will tell you that you can go through the whole Old Testament and you can find no distinction between these two words, that they are used interchangeably throughout the Old Testament. Well, and you don't have to go far in this chapter, or these first two chapters, to see that. These words are used 15 times in reference to God's creative work in these two chapters. And every time they're used interchangeably, just to indicate God's creative work in these 6 days. So let's go down to verse 25. Look at verse 25. Chapter 1. And God did what? Made. All right? Actually, go down to verse 26. We'll start there. We'll come back to that. Look at verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image." Well, what word is that? Yeah. According to our likeness, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, over all the earth, every creeping thing. Verse 27. So God did what? Oh, wait a minute, that's a different word. Created man. Same context. Two different Hebrew words, both mean the same thing. One says he made man. Other one says he created man. Used interchangeably. Look down at chapter 2. This is interesting. My Bible says, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work, which what? God had created and what? Made. Well, wait a minute. That's in the same sentence. Go on, verse 4. This is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God did what? Made. Does anybody see a difference in those two words? No, they're just being used interchangeably throughout this account. You can go into Psalm 148, 1 through 5, Nehemiah 9, 6, Exodus 20, 11, and see the same thing. But go back up to chapter 1 and look at verse 21. So God did what? Created great sea creatures. But now down in verse 25, what did he do with the land animals? He made them. Well, is one of them different from the other? He created the sea creatures. He made the land animals, all in the same week. No difference in those two words. He was not intending to communicate a different message by using different words. We do the same thing in our own language. I could come in here, I wouldn't do this right now, but in the summertime I might come in here before class and be talking to Tom, and Tom says, "What'd you do yesterday?" And I say, I mowed the yard. And then 10 minutes later, Mark walks in and says, "What'd you do yesterday?" So I cut the grass. Now, did I say two different things? Or the same thing? I said the same thing. We do this a lot of times just to avoid what? In our speech pattern. What? Yeah, monotony. We can say a lot of things, and we can say the same thing in a lot of different ways. Okay. God's done the same thing in his book. And you see this a lot. You see a lot of parallelism in Hebrew poetry. In Psalm 19:1, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God," and what? Firmament or the expanse shows his handiwork. That's the exact same phrase. Exact same thing.
Hey, Greg,
Yeah.
when you read Proverbs 8 verses 22 and 23, it says, "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his ways, before his works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth." What does that really mean?
I didn't catch it all. What verse are you looking at?
Proverbs 8 verses 23.
I'll look at it later. I don't know if it has any bearing on our study. Let me mention this before we get out of here. Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and its fullness, the world and those who dwell there." Saying the same thing twice. One central message, different phraseology. So that's not really helpful to the gap theorist. You've got a problem with Exodus 20:11. Number two, there's no evidence in the Bible of some rebellion of Satan that took place on earth. I don't doubt that Satan rebelled against God, but there's nothing in the Bible about it taking place on earth. We're going to pick up with this next week and finish it very quickly, but it's also a false theory because it talks about humans dying, living and dying before Adam and Eve lived and died. You're going to have a problem with 1 Corinthians chapter 15 if that's your position. Why? 1 Corinthians chapter 15 says what about Adam? He was the first man. Okay, we'll pick up there next week, get into age theory.